and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We begin today's show in Brussels. On Monday, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi attended the 9th China-European Union high-level strategic dialogue. Amid rising unilateralism and economic uncertainty, will cooperation or competition define the relationship between China and the EU? Take a look at this first.
China's top diplomat says China is bringing positive energy to its ties with the European Union. After attending the 9th China-European Union high-level strategic dialogue on Monday, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said there will be further cooperation, more stability, and better connectivity in the world as China strengthens its ties with the European Union. As China and the U.S. continue their trade negotiations, third countries are also finding their places. Germany, the EU's biggest economy, finds itself caught between the Union's two largest trading partners. Reports say that earlier this month, the U.S. warned Germany that granting contracts to Chinese tech giant Huawei will cause Berlin to lose access to Washington's intelligence. Last week, German Chancellor Angela Merkel made it clear that Germany does not take orders from the U.S. She said that when it comes to building the 5G network, we are defining our standards for ourselves. In the meantime, the European Union is also asking itself how to better work with a stronger China. Last week, the European Commission published a review of the Union's relations with China and proposed 10 action points to rebalance ties. The review will be discussed during the EU Council meeting that takes place this Thursday. On the same day, Chinese President Xi Jinping will begin his European tour.
President Xi's upcoming visit sends a clear and explicit message. That is, regardless of international changes, China always regards the European Union as an important partner of strategic cooperation and places China-Europe relations at a priority place on its diplomatic agenda.
As Italy is poised to become the first G7 country to officially participate in the Belt and Road Initiative, European countries are choosing what's best for their own development.
For more on the latest state of China-EU relations, in London we have Ian Begg, a professor at the European Institute and co-director of the Darendor Forum of the London School of Economics and Political Science. In Beijing, we have Wang Yi, Jean Monnet Chair Professor and Director of the Center for European Studies at Renmin University. Also joining us, last but not least, we have Matt Harborne, President of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. Gentlemen, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
I want to start by asking you, Mr. Harborne. You are someone building the bridge between China and EU, and for business community, the better the relations, the better the business. However, look at the recent developments. How would you assess the nature of this relation so far, China and the EU now?
Well, I would say from a business point of view, it's still quite good. We will publish our business conference survey later this year, but I can already now say that 2018 was a very good year for European companies, and the outlook for the future is also quite bright. So I think from a business point of view, it's quite good.
Professor Begg, March the 21st, the Europeans are going to have their own meetings, talking about their plans for the future and their, hopefully, coordinated approach, according to French President words, toward China. What's likely to be the topics and the direction?
Well, I can see a tension between two phenomena affecting the EU-China relationship. On the one side, China is a competitor, and there's no denying that's the case. China is a competitor in manufactured goods, increasingly in high technology, and to some degree for the direction of foreign investment. But China is also a collaborator in things like climate change, in things like trying to deal with security challenges such as Iran nuclear. And increasingly, I think we can see that China is in some ways a bulwark against the unpredictability of the United States. I don't know if you recall the novel by George Orwell, 1984, where he referred to 3 global blocks, Eurasia, East Asia and Oceania. It's beginning to look as though his prediction was coming correct.
Well, 35 years ago. The China-EU relationship, according to some, is not without challenges. Take a look. On March the 12th, EU policymakers at the European Commission released a paper labeling China as, quote, an economic competitor and, quote, systematic rival promoting alternative models of governance, end of quote. Now, Professor Wang, here in Beijing studio, many look at that report from China and they say, wow, is China-EU relations also going down the road like that between China and the United States? How would you assess the current state?
Well, I don't think it's the same. I think the U.S. is more concerned about its called leadership, which Chinese think is the hegemony, the alliance system, particularly the dual use, like Huawei, 5G, all this. The European Union countries particularly focus on the comparative advantage of the European Union, they're relatively declining, and the other normative power cannot set the rules and norms for the international relations, so they fear more competition from China. Actually, there's no zero-sum game, so-called an alternative to the challenge of the universal values. The Chinese way is, we are still a developing country. We try to make the high level of the European standard into practice in the developing countries. So it's not challenging this, actually.
All right. Mr. Harborn, my interest to you, rather the question is, does the EU or the European countries need to choose as to which camp to stand in, whether it's the European with the United States, or is it China, or the Europeans tend to have their own independent judgment?
Of course we do, and I think...
I know you would say that. Is it only a diplomatic slogan?
No, that's quite true, but I think what we're seeing now is a rising China, and the document you just referred to is a Europe that has to understand how to adopt the rise in China, how to engage with the rise in China, how to protect itself against what it sees as distorting measures.
No. If you hear the word competitor, rival, it does not sound necessarily engagement in nature.
It does if you read the document, but it's also about how to strengthen Europe in the competition with China. Then it's about another thing. It's about a stronger China, how to adapt itself to its new role in the world. I think this is what this document is trying to address. And these are very relevant questions.
All right. Professor Beck, do you think those are really the nature of that report? Will the European leaders look at that report and also through discussions among themselves be able to reach conclusions?
Yes, they will, because the report is saying what I said in my initial answer, that China is 2 things, competitor and collaborator. And in the competition side, there is concern that China is so effective. But it's also worth looking at individual European countries. For Germany and for Sweden, which I guess is where Mats is from, it's also a big opportunity to be able to sell to China, to collaborate with China on new technologies. Climate change is going to be increasingly dominating the agenda. So I wouldn't look at the report from the European Commission as being all negative. It's flagging up risks, and that's a very proper thing for it to do, but it's not saying that this is a reason not to collaborate.
If I could share with all of you, gentlemen, an earlier interview I did with Mr. Kong Chuan, who is the former Chinese ambassador to France. He shared with me earlier Charles de Gaulle's words when bucking opposition from France's Western allies in having diplomatic ties with China. By the way, 55th anniversary China-French diplomatic ties this year. He said, and he was quoting, "It's a choice with necessity and reason." Listen in.
Une option de l'évidence et une option de raison. 我认为当时他谈到必然的选择和理性的选择的时候
I think when he talked about the choice of necessity and reason, he thought that he could not ignore a rising China playing a greater role in international affairs. So I think he used these 2 words. When I quoted these 2 words from President Charles de Gaulle at this meeting, there was still a very positive response. I think today, France and other European countries should also have a choice of necessity and reason.
Of course, that's coming from Ambassador Kong Zhen, Chinese ambassador, former ambassador to France. He's talking about a quote. Charles de Gaulle, the then president of France, 55 years ago, was talking to his colleagues from Western allies about the French choice of having diplomatic relations with China. Of course, things have changed. You know, gentlemen, we know that. It's very different now, a picture. But the question really is, it's not just about China and the European countries together. It's also about what the European countries really want for themselves. What's their own aspirations, Mr. Harborn?
Yeah, it's correct. I mean, I think in relation to China, we want two things. We want to strengthen our own competitiveness, but then we also want to tap in to the developments in China. And there are two things here. One is, of course, the growing market, the consumers, but the other one is also China's innovation explosion, which offers opportunities for foreign companies to pick up good ideas. It can also be distorting or disruptive to foreign companies. So we need to be in China for all these reasons.
Professor Wang?
I think in general, China's rising is a more marketization force because we have so populist and a huge market, particularly in the digital economy. So European Union identifies as a normative power, set the rules and norms. So we need to work together to set the new rules like in 5G, I think. So exactly the competition from China is not good for Europe. Otherwise, they want to use us as challenger from China to coordinate the industrial policy. Maybe that's the case.
Exactly. In that specific policy paper, industrial policies and manufacturing policies were mentioned.
Yes. It talks about Europe strengthening artificial intelligence and battery technology. But may I say another thing? When we talk about bilateral trade and investments, it's quite complex. On the one hand, we have Chinese companies selling products to Europe, European companies selling products to China. But we also have Chinese companies being sub-suppliers to European companies and Chinese sub-suppliers being sub-suppliers to European companies. So it's all complex. We're all in it together, so to speak.
And therefore, it's not black and white.
No, it's very gray.
It would be very naive if people think it's black and white.
Yes.
However, Professor Beck, I mean, the big brother, Washington, is calling on everybody, all the allies, not to use the Chinese technology. Otherwise, you're dampening your own national security. Will the Europeans have a second thought about this? Well, this is only one area of industry that we're talking about here. There are other areas that maybe Washington also have warnings about in the future. So how will the Europeans react? And I know I'm not naive either. The Europeans are divided into 28 countries that we're talking about here, even the EU itself. So Professor Begg, it's quite a complicated picture.
It is, and the reason that this has become so sensitive at the moment is this strange dispute that's going on with Huawei, where the Americans are asserting without any real evidence that Huawei is determined to spy for the Chinese government. Now, I think when we listen to Ren Zhengfei answer this, the CEO of the founder of Huawei, he gives a very robust answer. But where I think the Chinese government could help in this is if the Chinese government were to say unequivocally, no, we are not using Huawei for spying purposes. Huawei is a great technology leader and should be respected for what it does, rather than being accused of these very difficult choices.
The Chinese Premier Li Keqiang at his annual press conference said something similar, but do not necessarily mention any company's name. I guess there's a difference between what the government say and the business say. He talked about it's not within the Chinese legal framework to have the government to ask business to do that. Not now, not in the future, and not in the past either. But that's what he said during the press conference. Now I want to come back to you with the same question, Mr. Harborn. Will the Europeans be able to make their own decisions? Or the logic after the Second World War, which is the institution of the world being established mainly by America, and that tradition will continue because that's a convenient choice for the Europeans. They don't have to have a second thought. They just go whatever the Americans advise them to do. And I know Europeans are smart, but you know, it's an easier choice.
No, I think Europe will make its own assessment of the safety concerns.
You are living in China for decades.
No.
Do you really know what the Europe feels?
Absolutely. We hear that from our member companies. But I think the key issue here is China's national intelligence law, Clause 7, which gives rise to concern in Europe. Is it so that a company or an individual can be forced to disclose information? Is that only valid in China, or is it extraterritorial? That is the core issue.
That's one of the examples, Professor Wang.
I think it's a mistrust about the Chinese political system. Everything you think the Communist Party leader and you can do everything different with you. I think the Chinese national intelligence law, nothing different with as other countries as a big power. And Huawei is global. Huawei is not just a Chinese company. They have their own global interests. So it's like the U.S. or the European company, global companies. I think not necessarily that you link the China model or Communist Party with Chinese private company like Huawei. So this is the
there's another question. What you have just said led me to ask another question rather, Mr. Harborn. For example, because of mistrust, there's likely to be millions of questions like what people are asking about Huawei. If you don't have Huawei, you have somebody else, right? So as long as that mistrust exists, you could always have questions of similar nature. And therefore, are we going to continue to ask questions back and forth rather than doing things? I think that is a big question that people should ask both sides to themselves. Mr. Harborn, from the business community perspective. I
totally agree. I mean, the basis for doing business is mutual trust. So we all need to seek the real facts in a matter like this. But I think also there has to be reassurances that Huawei is an independent global company.
Well, today our topic is not about Huawei. We're only using it as a case study, isn't it? To illustrate what's going on right now between China and Europe, and what should be, in fact, the factors of discussion. Professor.
I think besides the...
and I'll go to Professor Begg later. Professor Wang first. Go ahead.
Besides the distrust about China, about China's government, about Chinese company, another key issue is because Europe actually is not so independent. That's the reason Chancellor Merkel always said the destiny of the Europe should be in our hands, not just rely on the US, actually. In the industrial system, they don't have the independent search engine. That's the reason AI, digital economy, they fell lag behind, not just the US, but even by China. So that's nervous, and then make China as a competitor, and then...
is that a reasonable analysis of what's going on in the European continent? Will that still haunt Europe from now on, Professor Begg?
Well, I think Europeans are generally concerned about the role of high-tech companies in misusing information. We've seen it with Facebook. We've seen it with the concerns about the way Google operates in Europe. We've seen it with Microsoft. So it's not exclusively an accusation leveled at Huawei or other Chinese companies. There is this particular sensitivity about communications technologies. We shouldn't neglect the fact that new technologies are coming up elsewhere, particularly in the life sciences, where I would expect an explosion of life sciences activity to take place before very long. So we need to go beyond thinking about this very narrow question of spying through the telecommunications network to see how these three big blocks, three equal-sized economies in the world, can collaborate better and avoid these mutual jealousies and complications.
But Professor Begg, I think my question still stands here. That is, people would assume, but the Europeans, it's easier to choose America, just like that, because that was the way it used to be, and that can be an easy way for the future. Of course, whether you pay a price for that or not, that's another question. But Chinese side, it seems what Professor Wang is saying, China does not want the Europeans to choose. You don't have to choose between America or China, but rather to work with whichever party that you feel like that will give you the best benefits for the Europeans. So now, here's the question. That question still stands. You choose convenience, or you choose what is best for your interest. Go ahead, sir.
Well, I think we should recognize that the American-European relationship is also a security one through NATO. And that, therefore, becomes a bedrock of European thinking. Europe thinks the US is a guarantor of its security. China, until quite recently, was seen as something much more alien, not involved in the security environment in which the EU operates. Now we have the new approach coming inside Washington, which is much more hostile, not just to China, but also to some European companies, hence this concern about that Merkel has articulated. So Europeans are not being faced so much with a choice as a reassessment of how reliable the Americans are compared with the way they used to be even as recently as the Obama presidency.
Mr. Harborn?
Well, I think also the strategic outlook document talks about cooperation and engagement in climate,
Exactly,
in
yes.
peace, in WTO,
Yeah.
rule-based world order, and so on. And it's also calling for us to pick down the low-hanging fruits, like concluding the comprehensive agreement on investment, to get the geographic indicators in place, the GPA, and so on. So I think the document calls for a lot of cooperation. Yeah.
You think that would be the way forward?
Absolutely, and I would like to add another thing.
But before you add another
Yes.
thing, Mr. Harborn, I have to remind you, you got 28 countries, 28 different economies. One the UK, which is having their own issues to handle with right now, but it's 27. And you got 27, among which they all have their different opinions. Okay, the so-called old and the new, which you don't like to be labeled like that, but it does exist, some differences of opinions. Even among the Central and the European countries, they also have their different views among themselves. So are you going to have a so-called coordinated, I have to borrow the word from the French president again, approach toward China?
All the areas
Or others?
All the areas I just mentioned, I think there is a common view that we need to move forward. When it comes to reciprocity, when it comes to investment access, I think there's a common view. And there's another thing, my issue I want to add. I think we also want to have regulatory cooperation with China, because regulatory cooperation creates level playing fields, but it also opens new business areas in China that creates further growth. So here I think we have a common consensus on how to move on.
Professor Wang, okay, China got this China-U.S. negotiations going on. That's going to be quite a task for both sides, particularly China, I guess, as well. Now, China also have the European partners at this critical moment looking forward to a great deal with China. So how will China be able to handle all of these different approaches, particularly this time toward the European counterparts?
Well, I think the transatlantic relations, since the end of the Cold War, gone to the bottom, I think, maybe like a Munich International Security Conference indicates. China can be the bridge to connect each other. As I said, China is a more marketization force. U.S. is more innovation force. And the European is more normative norms. So how can you make norms work together with the China's market force? And how can you make your innovation force into practice, China, work together with China? So still, we have many complaints about China. Think about China as a competitor. At the same time, both sides, I think, need China to cooperate to deal with the common challenges, even for their own economic growth, innovation.
Right.
So thus, we are not so pessimistic about the future.
Right. Earlier, before we come into the studio, Mr. Harborn, you were telling me that people tend to look at the negative part of things, particularly in the media. Well, probably that's the nature of the media's job. But on the other hand, you advocate a more balanced approach. The question really is, will that balanced approach happen on time?
I think we as businesses actually are advocates of a balanced approach. And I think, as we all know, business is a peace movement. The more we work, the more we do business, the more we find common paths. So I think we will find that balanced way. It's not too late at all.
Will that peace movement really happen?
It's happening as we speak.
Okay, well, let's go to Professor Beck, who maybe have a different opinion. Professor Beck, you go ahead.
Well, yes, as an economist, I like to think in terms of incentives. The incentives are there for the Chinese side and for the European side to collaborate better. So yes, there is plenty of opportunity for this to occur, because the common difficulty, I won't say enemy, common difficulty at the moment of the US threatening the international rules-based trading system, as was mentioned earlier. These are the things that the European side and the Chinese side have so much common ground on, alongside wanting a resolution on climate change and on the Iran nuclear deal. So there is so much common ground that I see the incentives as being strong.
All right. Before we go, I only have 30 seconds left. A lot of things to happen. Chinese President Xi Jinping going to visit some of the major European countries. Then it will be followed up early April by the China-EU summit. So what can we expect from now on? Everybody, one sentence for me. Professor Beck, you go first.
Well, I see he's visiting Monaco. I hope he realizes that it's a tax avoidance haven, Monaco. But it will be about making sure barriers fall.
Okay. Mr. Harborn?
Finding projects of cooperation and concluding the CAI.
Okay. Professor Wang?
China, you work together to make the norms and the rules more inclusive, sustainable, and justice.
All right. I think every one of you abide by the time, and we had a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for coming over to our program through your different perspective. Wang Yi, Yin Beck, last but not least, Het Harborn. Thank you, really appreciate it.